And we're back talking about the Endangered Species Act, also known as the ESA, which was passed in 1973. Um, so, the history of the Endangered Species Act back in 1966, the Endangered Species Protection Act was passed, and that was like the first try of our federal government to help endangered species. And what it did was it authorized that the government could purchase land that was an appropriate habitat for endangered species, because a lot of the reasons why species are endangered is because their habitat, was going away, being developed, or, something along those lines. Um, then up a few years later in 1969, the federal government, the Congress passed the Endangered Species Conservation Act. So this authority to purchase this land for habitat was continued, and it also banned importing any species that was threatened with extinction in other countries, worldwide extinction. So if you had a black rhino that was endangered in a different country, you couldn't capture it and bring it to the United States. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act, as we know it, was passed and signed by uh, Richard Nixon, who happened to be president when a lot of these environmental laws were passed. Okay, so you can find it at 16 United States Code, starting at section 1531. This is maybe one of the environmental laws that we're quasi familiar with. I have this link, which I love. You can just get lost in this sometimes. Sometimes I just have it up. But it's in Iowa. They have this bald eagle's nest, and then they have the live camera on the bald eagles. So yeah, this is what they're doing, right now. And then looks like they have babies, and then sometimes the mom's away getting food for the babies, but it looks like these babies were very recently hatched if you look at their fur. So it's just like very, very peaceful. If you put on the volume, it's just like, birds and wind. And so anyway, but one of our, more famous protected species are the bald eagles. All right. So, what is an endangered species? An endangered species is a species that is at risk of extinction throughout like all of its range, right? Its habitat or a significant portion. So that's like the highest classification of this species may no longer exist. Um, then you have a a lower category, which is threatened species. So that's a species that's likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future, again, through either all or a significant part of its range. Um, so they're defined differently, endangered and threatened species, but in practice, there's not a lot of distinction that is made regarding the safeguards to protect both of those categories. So a lot of most of the protections in the Endangered Species Act also covers these threatened species. Okay, so then we talk about critical habitat. Critical habitat is the area, the habitat that is vital to the survival of an endangered species. And then part of what the ESA has requires is that we keep a list of all endangered species. Um, so we know what the species we have to protect. Okay, so how do you get um, a species on the endangered species list? Okay, so your Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Interior are the ones that have the big job of figuring out what species get on this list. So there's a certain procedure, just like, all environmental regs. So a citizen files a petition to include this certain species on the endangered species list under the Administrative Procedures Act. Okay, so then the secretaries have 90 days to decide whether, they have this petition is sufficient. Um, not even whether there's any case made that there's listing. So, if I had my little Aussie doodle on the list, there's plenty of dogs out there, so they're not in any danger of extinction. So they would be like, no, that's ridiculous. Um, so the 90 days should kind of make an initial determination, and then they have a year after that to determine whether or not to put the species on the list. And they have to use not only the application, but the best scientific and commercial data that is available to make this decision. And again, to determine the critical habitat, they also have to use this best scientific data available, and you have to take into account the economic impact of putting the species on the list, or specifying a certain area as a critical habitat. So if I, designated like Times Square as a critical habitat for, I know they have some like birds that nest in some of the high rises, maybe the economic impact of like closing it off to commerce may be too great. Okay, next slide here. Okay, so once you are on a species is on the list, there are certain protections given. Okay, so the agencies have to implement programs. So before they can make any agency action, they have to ensure that their actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any of the species on the list, so endangered or threatened, or result in somehow the destruction or an adverse modification of the critical habitat. Then, the listing thing, they're not like, they don't just put these species on the list willy-nilly, like, oh yeah, there's fewer coyotes out there, let's put them on the list, right? They it's a very kind of high standard to get an animal on the list, because if it is on a list, then there's a high standard of action or inaction, vis-a-vis the species and its habitat. So, sometimes in the past, they've listed species too soon, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with the TVA versus Hill case. That maybe it's not even a real species. So there's like an example that some jumping mouse, um, it's actually like not really even a specific jumping mouse. It's just like a regular mouse. So they called it this special pre-bull meadow jumping mouse, and we're protecting its habitat. But meanwhile, it's no different from your garden variety mouse. Okay, so all right, so any federal agency, they have to have programs to protect these species. They can't do anything harmful to the habitat, or they have to worry about the habitat before they take any kind of action. Part of its pre-building process. And then the process of what we call taking a species is prohibited. Okay, so a taking includes things like hunting, like we were just talking about with the birds, hunting, trapping, harming, harassing. So if you just even like, shoot a gun in the air to like disperse something, that would be harassing, or, somehow doing something bad to cause it angst. Okay, so taking of any species on the list is prohibited in certain specific circumstances, usually like for research or somehow protection of the species. You can ask for an incidental take permit. Okay, so that's only issued under an approved habitat conservation plan. So the habitat conservation plan is a plan that is made to protect an endangered species from inappropriate taking. Yeah, and harming, courts have found that the harming means things like any damage to habitat. So not just harming the animal, but if I'm throwing acid in the water, then I am harming the habitat, ergo harming the species. Okay, yeah, I talked about that. Um, so landowners, just like all the environmental laws, like been talking about all semester, there's always a conflict between the environment. Here we're talking about endangered species, and what may be termed as progress or the rights of property owners or landowners and developments. So there is oftentimes conflict. So pause me right now. There's like a really funny Simpsons video to watch called Scream a Pillar, which I can't stream here because um, then they'll block my video for copyright violation. So pause me and put that on and then come back. So sometimes since there is like, a conflict, and you might even call it like a taking. If I have property that I can't use the way I want to because of this endangered species, then it's like the federal government's taking the value out of my property. So local governments and land developers, they kind of and landowners got together and created these habitat conservation plans. One of an example is something called the National Community Conservation Planning Program, which helps preserve in California what we call the scrub habitat. So just think of like the little grasses, almost like a prairie, but without the high grasses. Um, so pause. Sorry, I want to pause this for a second, but it's not letting me get out of here. Sorry about that. I got distracted. So I wanted to refocus. So anyway, yeah, this conflict between landowners, developers, and the issue about maybe protected species. So one of the elements of the Endangered Species Act, creates these what they call safe harbor agreements or safe harbor programs. So in these safe harbor programs, it's like the developers and landowners are incentivized to develop their land that has ways of attracting endangered species. So say it's like, fish or waterfowl, and then they're creating little um, tide pools or, good feeding areas for something along the lines of that. And that might be really nice. Say you're developing something on a golf course or a pretty area. But then you don't want, as a developer, like, well, what if I attract one of these endangered species to live on my land and then I can't do things with my land later? So these safe harbor agreements say, like, if you do these things to attract or create habitats for threatened and endangered species, we are not going to later put additional restrictions on you. So those are called safe harbor agreements. There is here's one on this is the fishery website. So like um there's one in 2016. The fisheries completed the first safe harbor agreement in our country in this California Dry Creek watershed. Um, and private landowners supported the recovery for some, fish, some salmon, and things like that. So hopefully that was like a happy ending. I also posted in the module like another thing about safe harbor agreements from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, because yeah, a lot of our land is federal land, but a lot of our land is also owned by private owners. So if private owners can do their best to create or to develop their lands in a way that may protect or reduce the number of endangered or threatened species, like everybody wins. So that's what the safe harbor agreements are about. So you'll see them um, in the module. I have like an example. Okay, so this is like my first environmental case I ever learned about back when I was in law school. It's the TVA versus Hill, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority. So in Tennessee, they were going to dam up this river to create a hydroelectric plant because that was like the thing to do back in the day. In the 70s, because we're like, oh, it's kind of clean energy. We're getting hydroelectric power. We're not burning coal or working with nuclear power or something like that. So they were building this dam to create this hydroelectric power plant. And a citizen suit occurred, and they claimed that building this dam would destroy a habitat of a snail darter. This is what a snail darter looks like, a little fish, which was on the endangered species list at the time. And this area that they were damming up was kind of thought to be the critical habitat of the snail darter. And this that point, like they had like spent like a gajillion dollars already to build this dam. So the court held, there wasn't a lot of discretion on the part of the court. They held in favor of the snail darter and the Endangered Species Act. And so the act was later altered to give the courts a little more leeway, some guidelines of things to look for, maybe economic investment versus this. And then they like ended up, remember when I was talking about things being listed as endangered too early, this was not like the only critical habitat. Like these things were swimming all over the place. So this little Tennessee Valley area was not the only place that the snail darter was around. But recent decisions continue to uphold the ESA and the authority of Congress to protect these endangered species. There was one where like the Court of Appeals upheld applying the act, and there was to protect this little invertebrates that were found in 2 caves in Texas. And so even though you might not think an invertebrate that only lives in 2 cases, Texas is like all that important, the Endangered Species Act says, yes, they are. What was the one thing I was just reading about? I think it was a China thing. Oh, it was about COVID with China. So they're talking about this like zero COVID policy in China and how it was akin to a policy under Mao in the 50s, 60s, 50s, where they were there was a sparrow that everybody thought was like a big pest. And, all the people, all the farmers, their job, or they were instructed to like kind of hang out in these fields. And every time the sparrow tried to like land, they would, make noise so that the sparrow couldn't land, and then they like died of exhaustion. So this sparrow population was like completely depleted in China. And then, guess what happened? um, all the things that the sparrow was usually eating, like smaller bugs, mosquitoes, other pests, were now like running rampant in the region. And, it caused like an environmental like imbalance, and it was a terrible thing. So that's why we try to protect all our species. Um, so there is an interesting provision in the Endangered Species Act that creates this process um, to create a committee of bigwigs, high-ranking government officials who can determine whether we don't place a species on the Endangered Species Act. So an exemption is granted um, to this government action that might hinder or eliminate an endangered species. So they might grant this exemption if there's a proposed government action and there's like nothing, it's got to be done, and there's no other reasonable or prudent alternative. If this government action is somehow in the public interest and the benefits of the action clearly outweigh the benefits of the alternatives that don't pose risks to the Endangered Species Act, to that endangered species. So like you might think of that if you really thought that this dam was necessary in the Tennessee Valley, and there was a lot of money already put into it. There were no other alternatives for power or whatever this dam was going to be used. Maybe it was being used to create a water source, a reservoir. And a risk benefit analysis. So this is kind of something that changed after the TVA case. So this little like cobble of I I always assume it's like a bunch of old men, but it might not be. Um, make this decision, and they call this committee the God Squad. So if the God Squad grants an exemption, then a committee can do things that technically violate the Endangered Species Act. Um, so yeah, so it overrules this like no jeopardy rule, which the Endangered Species Act says that no endangered or threatened species be placed in jeopardy by the actions of a federal agency. So the God Squad can overrule the no jeopardy rule. There have been a bunch of, not a bunch, but some species that, like, due to the protections given under the Endangered Species Act, they've been delisted. So, like gray wolves, a bat. I think like manatees maybe were. Oh no, it's not here anymore. I'm gonna pause this and find it. I hate it when they change where things are. But here's a list of some of the things that have been delisted under the endangered, from the being endangered or threatened. So here's like a tree frog, a tern is a bird, a hawk, a lot of birds, a couple parrot, the bald eagle. There we go. So it was listed in 1967, delisted in 2007. Owls, sparrows, yeah, a lot of birds. Fish, a duck. I did think that a manatee was protected at some point, and now they are off the protect. I don't think they were ever endangered, but I think they were protected, and now are not. Alligators. Um, We call that recovered. So, yeah, there's plenty of alligators, I guess. If you live in Florida, or the Carolinas or somewhere south, you might know that. A flying squirrel, sea lions. Look at that. Isn't that awesome? How successful it's been. Okay. So those are species saved by the Endangered Species Act. Okay. One of recent, well, not so recent, but past 20 years decision is Gibbs versus Babbitt. And the plaintiffs were these private landowners, and they felt that a regulation that limited taking of red wolves on private land, right? So they had wolves on their land, which were probably threatening their own wildlife on their land. And they thought that not being able to take, remove, harass, not allow them on their land was a taking that would in violation of the Constitution, right? Where things cannot be taken without due process or compensation. So the district court, right, the trial court said that the reg was valid under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and then the circuit court affirmed, saying that this regulation affected interstate commerce because it was part of this comprehensive plan for protection of endangered species. So, they say that species conservation unfortunately does impose costs on private citizens. So since states sometimes make decisions that don't always protect these species, the federal government has to step in and do that. So they can do what they want for endangered species. Now, more recently, 2018, Weyerhaeuser, that's fun to say, versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So that's a United States Supreme Court case. So the Wildlife Service, they decided to designate this 1,500-acre site in Louisiana for a critical habitat for the dusty gopher frog. And they thought that this was not a critical habitat under the ESA because the dusty gopher frog no longer lived in that area. And the Court of Appeals said that a critical habitat would imply that that they were habitating there. So, anywho, so that. Is that a failure of the Endangered Species Act, or was that just something bad that the Wildlife Service had been doing? So as we know, we our endangered species stuff can only cover what we do in the United States. They can ban importation of endangered species. I know it was a big thing when Trump was president that he was changing a rule about importing ivory or heads of endangered species that were hunted in different countries. And I'm sure that's gone now, but that was a big thing when you wanted to demonize President Trump. You talk about how he wants to kill rhinos and things like that. But okay, so the only way you deal with things not happening on our shores is through a treaty or convention. So the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species is an effort to protect commerce of endangered species. So in some Asian countries, rhino horn dust is valuable, ivory, people that or kill elephants for ivory, things like that. So this convention, which the United States Oh, it's actually pronounced CITES. Sorry, not cities. Um, it bans commercial trade in endangered species, and the ones that are highly endangered, I guess, more endangered than threatened, and it severely regulates trade in less endangered species. So I guess they have more of those animals still around. Um, but the problem with this convention or this treaty or this agreement, whatever you want to call it, is it's difficult to enforce. So the poachers, people who are going in and killing these animals in other countries, they're not like putting on the box, rhino horn here. They're like packaging their product, calling it something else. I don't know, protein powder. Um, so say you're shipping a pair of crocodile shoes. Um, Once it's processed and like in a pair of cool looking shoes, it's kind of tough to determine, well, was that an endangered crocodile? You'd have to go, I don't know how you, like, I guess you could have to do DNA testing on it. So it's very, very hard to enforce and police. And really the successes that have occurred have been through undercover enforcement, and that's obviously expensive. You got to get somebody in there to buddy up to the poachers and things like that. Um, and some high value endangered species like parrots, elephants, grizzly bears, are continue. There is poaching that still goes on. All right, so that's going to be the end of this section of my lecture, and then I'll go on and do the third one, and then we'll be done with lecture for the day.